I'd just like to take a moment to thank all those who support the show via Patreon. I've had a few new supporters this past month and I am very grateful. Twice a month I do the show for free. If you enjoy the show and would like to support it, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. There you can agree to make a small contribution to help me run the show, and it is hugely appreciated. Hello. In this episode, we're looking at the peculiar situation the Republic of Ireland, Eire, found itself during the Second World War. Along with countries such as Sweden, Switzerland and Spain, Eire trod the difficult path of remaining neutral. With all that entailed, one question that needed to be dealt with was what to do with those servicemen from belligerent nations who found themselves in Ireland by way of crashed planes or naval personnel rescued from sunk shipping. I'm joined by Bernard Kelly. Bernard is an Irish historian whose book, Military Internees, Prisoners of War and the Irish State During the Second World War, looks at these issues. Thanks for joining me, Bernard. Let's start with the position of the Republic of Ireland at the outbreak of the war.
Well, at the time, we're talking about the 26 counties of what is now the Republic, but in those days it was officially called Eire after the 1937 Constitution. So when the Second World War broke out in September 1939, Eamon de Valera and his government, his Fianna Fáil government, declared neutrality, and they were the only Commonwealth. I suppose they were technically still a dominion at that point, but they were the only dominion to declare neutrality, and so they wanted to stay out of the war, which was somewhat of an anomaly because obviously the 6 counties then of Northern Ireland were still in the UK, so they were part of the war. So you have this island off the coast of Britain that's virtually in the war zone, and 3/4 of it is neutral, and a very small, the top northeastern corner of it is part of a belligerent. So it was a very odd situation.
What did neutrality entail?
The obvious answer to that is that basically the Irish government wanted to stay out of the war, but there was an awful lot more to it than that. I mean, declaring neutrality is one thing, actually avoiding the war is another thing, as the Low Countries and Holland and Belgium found out. Basically, there was the sort of the diplomatic aspect of it, of getting the belligerents to respect and acknowledge your neutrality, and then you have the internal domestic aspects of it, where you have to deal with shortages of supplies and shortages of petrol and foods, and basically get the population on side. And again, like the strange situation that was on the island of Ireland, where less than 100 miles up the road from Dublin, you were in Belfast, where there was a direct train link, which was, one of the epicenters of the British manufacturing efforts. The Belfast shipyards turned out about 140 warships and probably about 5,000 tanks during the course of the war. So neutrality had operated on a couple of different levels, and again, it was a very, very strange situation to be in Ireland at the time.
I didn't realise they produced so much. Actually, it's Halland and Wolf, isn't it, in Belfast?
Yeah, they're the headline ones, but there was lots of little factories and lots of little sort of industries that sprung up in Northern Ireland during the war. Northern Ireland was the only part of the UK during the Second World War that had an unemployment problem all the way through, because they never fully harnessed the full productive capacity of Northern Ireland. But it played a pretty important role, particularly in manufacturing things, and obviously then as a physical base for the Royal Air Force and for the Royal Navy. Yeah,
that's interesting. Well, we could go down a rat hole there, but let's avoid it. So you mentioned the Royal Air Force. Presumably they were flying over the Atlantic and convoy patrols and things. And at some point, somebody is going to come down in Eire. So you've got British servicemen. What happens to them when they come down? Are they prisoners of war? Do they just get slapped on the back and train ticket and sent home? Or
This is probably the heart of the whole internment question, and really trying to answer that question was one of the reasons why I started researching the book. So during the course of the war, 103 British/Commonwealth aircraft came down on the territory of Eire. So you had a total of 453 British and Commonwealth aircrew who landed in neutral territory. Of that total, 159 of them were killed, and 45 of that amount were interned. So you have a total of 261 aircrew who were therefore allowed to leave after landing in Eire. As a neutral, Ireland had a responsibility to intern any and all members of the belligerent forces that landed on its territory during the war. And this was derived from international law, from the 1907 Hague Convention and the 1929 Geneva Convention. So technically, every member of the belligerent forces who landed in Ireland during the Second World War were supposed to be interned. But the rules which governed that were basically written before aerial warfare became a major factor in combat. So the fact that Ireland was so close to Britain, I mean, there was air bases in Northern Ireland, there were the airdromes and the naval bases were only a short hop across the Irish Sea. The fact that the British forces were so close to neutral Ireland meant that the Dublin government basically couldn't strictly enforce internment straight away. There had to be a sort of consideration built into it. Because basically, if the De Valera government interned everybody who landed in Ireland, Irish internment camps would have been filled to the gills, all with British forces, and most of them would have been Irish members of the British forces. There's a couple of different periods of the internment regime in Ireland that you need to go through. So from the outbreak of war up until August 1940, basically there was no internment policy, because in this time there was constant touchdowns and constant landings by mostly British aircraft, and also incursions by Royal Navy ships, which would have been the norm in peacetime. So in this early period of the war, for the first 11 months, the De Valera government effectively turned a blind eye, because, like I said, they didn't want to have this strict policy where they would have to lock everybody up. But obviously, once the Germans invaded France and the Battle of Britain occurred around the UK, and Ireland is very, very close to the war zone there, then obviously that policy has to change. So there was a strict-ish policy sort of between August 1940 up until sort of December 1941, when America joined the war. So in that period, all of the Germans who landed in Ireland and most of the British/Commonwealth aircrew and sailors who landed in Ireland were interned. We'll get onto it later, I'd say, but the entry of the US into the war in December 1941 changed the whole system entirely.
When you say interned, are they technically prisoners of war? What is internment? Was it entail?
Okay, well, the legal definition was that these men had to be kept from getting back to either of the belligerent forces. So they had to be kept from rejoining the war, because if there was favoritism shown to either side, then that would have negative impacts for the country's neutrality. They weren't prisoners of war. That's the first major thing we have to get out there. This was a belligerent internment camp in a neutral country. A prisoner of war camp is a totally different entity, and the people in it are are incarcerated for a totally different reason. This is an internment camp which had a lot of very, very sort of liberal concessions built into it. One of the most frustrating things about researching this and reading about this, about the internment regime in Ireland, is that everybody assumes it's a POW camp. And if you've ever seen a film called The Brill Cream Boys, which is sort of loosely based on what happened in the Courage during the Second World War, it's always described as this really odd and bizarre and sort of strangely Irish sort of solution to a problem that they were allowed to do this. But basically, what it was is there was a camp set up in the Curragh in a place that was called K Lines. All of the billets in the Curragh were named alphabetically, and this just happened to be the biggest one that was available. So it was number K, letter K, the K Lines. It was divided into two. It was divided into two groups. One was called B and one was called G, so one for British and one for German. Basically what you had is you had these two wired enclosures, B and G, and they were surrounded themselves by a high 7-foot tall wire fence. And the internees had to live within these confines, within this camp. But they were allowed to have parole. They were allowed to leave. They were allowed to stay out overnight, that sort of thing. But they had to sign a form saying that they promised that they wouldn't escape while they were out on parole. They had to come back and sign in every night. So there was three different types of parole. There was the camp parole, where they were allowed to roam around the military camp itself. There was local parole, where they could roam around an area up to 10 miles outside of the military camp. And then there was special parole, where they were allowed to go to Dublin, or allowed to basically go outside of the 10-mile exclusion zone. But it's very, very important to draw a distinction between people who are in an internment camp in a neutral country and people who are in a POW camp in a belligerent country, because the people who were interned in Ireland were basically given the same standard of treatment as they were given in Switzerland, and they were given in Sweden, and they were given in Spain and other European neutrals. This sort of treatment was standard across all European neutrals, and the Irish government was very, very careful to base its internment policy on the two closest neutrals, which were Switzerland and Sweden.
There was no favouritism because Britain was breathing down Ireland's neck, as Germany in Sweden were they slightly more sympathetic to the Germans because Germany was breathing down their neck?
This is probably one of the more complicated aspects of it because at the top level of the internment policy, it was very heavily biased in favour of the Allies. So as I said, 261 of the aircrew who landed, the British and Commonwealth aircrew who landed in Ireland, were released. They weren't detained. All of the 80 Germans, all of the 80 Luftwaffe aircrew who landed in Ireland, all of them were interned without exception. So at the top level, when the policy was implemented and formulated at the government level from De Valera down, it was heavily weighted in favour of the Allies. But inside the camp, on the ground, when the Department of Defence and the Irish Army who ran the camp, when they were actually implementing those policies, they were scrupulously trying to keep it very, very equal between the Axis and the Allied internees. So every concession they would offer to the Germans, they would offer to the British, and every time they would offer parole to the British, they would turn around and offer it to the Germans. So there's a dual sort of level thing going on here, where on one hand it's incredibly biased towards the Allies, but once you're in the camp, everything is very, very equal and is deliberately set out to be like that.
What were the relations like with the German government in respect to their internees? I mean, presumably they must have been aware that there was sort of a favouritism or a leaning toward the Allied cause.
The thing about the internees is that they had unsupervised monthly access to their diplomatic representatives. So this is something that POWs wouldn't have. So every time there was an issue within the camp, so if, say for example, in mid-1941, the German internees were very upset at the level of censorship of their letters, they threatened to take this to the German minister in Dublin, who was Edward Hempel. So every single little thing in the camp had the potential to turn into a serious diplomatic incident. And the various diplomatic representatives in Dublin, Sir John Maffey for the British, and David Gray for the Americans, and Hempel for the Germans, they were all very, very involved in the day-to-day running of the camp and the day-to-day lives of the actual internees there. As the Irish internment policy at the top level began to turn more and more and more towards the Allies, the German minister in Dublin made more and more frequent complaints and visits and letters to De Valera, sometimes in person or sometimes to the camp itself, complaining about the sheer amount of planes that were being released and aircrew that were being let go. But as the war went on, obviously, and as the tide of the war turned against Germany, its ability to pressurise Ireland got less and less and less as it became clear that the Axis were going to lose the war. Basically, by the end of the war, from about 1944 onwards, internment in Ireland was being operated solely against the Germans. Every single British or American or Canadian plane that landed in Ireland was being released. But at that late point in the war, the Germans simply, they had nothing to pressurise Ireland with. So by the end of the war, it was sort of pointless.
You did hints about it before, but they never interned any American personnel, did they?
No. Again, you go back to the facts and figures. So between January 1942 and the end of the war, 39 American aircraft came down in Ireland, and that was 275 aircrew, and they were all released. So there was obviously an undocumented decision made somewhere in the highest levels of the Irish government, and I've never been able to track down a document to confirm this, but clearly a decision was made somewhere, because the actions speak for themselves, because no Americans were ever interned or ever arrested by the Irish Army, and it didn't matter in whatever circumstances they landed. So in sort of late 1942, early 1943, Joseph Walsh, who was the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs in Ireland, and David Gray, who was the American minister in Dublin, they sat down and they had a series of face-to-face meetings. And basically what Walsh said to Gray is, we will look at all American flights landing in Ireland, and we will class them as either non-operational or operational. And everybody who lands on a non-operational flight will automatically be released. So the standard they set was, if you were flying a ferry flight, if you were flying materials, or if you were flying supplies, and you accidentally got lost and landed in Ireland, then they could release you. But if you had transparently been in combat, or if you were carrying live ammunition, or if you were carrying bombs, then they would have to intern you. But the trick was that the Irish government, every time an American aircraft landed in Ireland, the Irish government automatically classified it as non-operational, regardless of its actual status. And so therefore they had this unwritten agreement to release all American aircrew, whoever landed. They also rescued 9 American sailors. And, the German sailors who were rescued by Irish merchant shipping were all interned. Any American sailors were handed back over to the US Navy.
Did the Americans ever try to persuade the Irish to enter the war? I mean, they clearly must have had some sort of big stick to wield to get their personnel freed. But once the US enters the war, Ireland's surrounded by allies, but obviously America's a long way away. But if you appreciate what I mean. And there is a long ties between Ireland and the US. Was there any sympathy for joining on the Allied side?
At the top levels of the American government, there was very little sympathy for Irish neutrality, which is sort of a contradiction in that America was neutral itself for so long. So, for example, in April 1941, the Irish, he was the Minister for the Coordination of Defensive Measures. He was a sort of special minister that was coordinating all of the Irish defence matters. His name was Frank Aiken. He travelled to America basically to ask for weapons and to ask for some food aid and to ask for supplies. And the Roosevelt government basically said, we're not sending any arms to anybody who isn't going to join the fight against Germany. So there was an acceptance of Irish neutrality, but there was a disapproval of it. There was a real reluctance to sell or give the Irish any arms or any sort of supplies at all that would bolster neutrality. There was a major flashpoint then in February 1944 when the British and American governments asked Dublin to expel all of the Axis representatives because there was a German, an Italian and a Japanese representatives all still in Dublin, and Ireland still had diplomatic connections to them all. And the British and the Americans asked the Irish government to expel them, and De Valera predictably refused, saying that neutral countries are allowed to keep contacts with whoever they want. When that happened, the Irish Army was actually put on alert. There was rumours that the Americans were going to invade from Northern Ireland into the south. There was never any overt sort of you should join the war, but there was a lot of covert, behind the scenes pressure on Ireland, saying that if you join the war, you might get an awful lot more supplies, and if you join the war, you'd have a much better seat at the table at the end of the war when you divvy up all the resources of the world. But the De Valera government never bought it, I'm afraid.
We've talked about parole. Could they daily go out on parole, or were they some days in the camp and some days they were allowed out? Or
depending on what period in the war. So in the early days, parole was very, very heavily restricted. As the war went on and as the Irish government became more and more confident in dealing with the internees, because this is the first time the Irish Army has ever incarcerated members of the foreign forces. There's been plenty of internment camps in Ireland over the years, but this is the first time that the Irish government has ever actually had to deal with handling people of a different nationality. So at the early period of the war, there was a very, very strict internment policy. From sort of mid-1940 onwards, once the two sections of the camp began to fill up a little bit, it meant that it was completely impractical to keep them behind the wire the whole time. They started releasing them on daily parole on a staggered basis. So the Germans would get out one day, the Allies would get out the next. They were all given camp parole, so they were all allowed to use the sporting and the facilities of the military camp in the Curragh from, I think it was morning to afternoon. From about 10 in the morning till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they were all released into the confines of the camp itself, because the Curragh is a big military village. It's still the biggest military complex in Ireland. So it's a big military village. So they were allowed to go out and they were allowed to use the tennis courts and they were allowed to use the swimming pools and they were allowed to use the the gym and all that sort of stuff that was provided for the Irish Army. Then as the war went on and the camp got bigger and bigger, and the locals in the area got more and more used to dealing with these guys, the parole regime got looser and looser and looser. By the end of the internment period, basically all of the internees were allowed to sign out until 8 a.m. in the morning. So particularly what the British were doing is they would sign out, they'd go out for the day, and they'd only come back the next morning, they'd sign the book again and they would go back out. There was a gradual sort of loosening as it went on and on and on. There was a gradual loosening. It was helped by the fact that in the Allied side, they were all officers or NCOs. So by the rules that were laid down, they were allowed to have parole anyway. It was slightly more complex on the German side because all of the airmen were officers or NCOs. But an Irish ship called the Curlogue, it rescued 164 sailors in January 1944. And a lot of these were ratings, a lot of these were the equivalents of privates. And they didn't have the automatic right to have parole. So there was a little bit of juggling about what they were going to do about them and what the Allies would think of 162 or 164 German sailors suddenly let loose, to roam about Ireland as they as they pleased. So the parole regime depended on what part of the war it was in. But the Irish government was very, very, very keen to allow the internees to have parole. Firstly, because that's what other countries did. So in Sweden, you had to sign a form as you did in Ireland. You just had to sign a form saying that you promised you wouldn't escape, and you promised that you wouldn't, hatch any schemes against the government while you were out. And you were sort of held to your word of honour as an officer or an NCO that you would fulfil that. And the same sort of thing applied in Switzerland. So the internees in Switzerland were actually held in hotels in isolated alpine villages.
What are now expensive alpine villages?
Yeah. Well, ironically, one of them is Davos, where the world leaders all meet once a year. But basically, the internees in Switzerland, they were just kept in these isolated villages in the Alps, where if they tried to escape, they would be find it very difficult to walk across the Alps. And they were allowed into the village. They could mix with the locals. They could, supplement their diet by buying food in local restaurants. A lot of them wrote accounts after the war how they learned to ski. They did a lot of photography. They took day trips to Zurich and Geneva and all of this sort of stuff. So the Irish government was very keen to follow to not break the mould set by the two senior neutrals in Europe. But the other reason why the Irish government was so keen to allow a liberal parole regime is that it kept the internees happy. So there's no point locking up all these men together in this confined space. It's going to cause trouble. So the easier that they could make the internees' lives and the more contented with their lot, that meant that there would be less trouble behind the wire. And if there's less trouble, then there's less scope for the internees to complain to their diplomatic representatives, and then there's less scope for there to be, more aggro between Dublin and Washington and London and Berlin, of course.
Were they not seen as a security threat?
That depends on which government department you ask. So initially it was the Department of Defence and the Irish Army who ran the internment camp. And the OC of the camp was a fella called Colonel Thomas McNally, and he was deeply suspicious of them all. He was like, none of these guys are going to escape, and they're all going to, they're going to join with the Eire, and it's going to be awful. So they were seen initially as a security threat, particularly some of the internees who had detailed, technical knowledge. The Irish Army authorities were very afraid that these internees might make contact with the IRA and provide them with, bomb-making knowledge, or that sort of thing. The Department of External Affairs, on the other hand, didn't see them as a threat because they said, look, these are officers, these are NCOs, these are their parole laws as they're laid down in international law. If these guys don't hold to their word of honour, we can just simply lock them all up and we can take parole away from them. So it depends on who you ask. So the army was very suspicious of them. External Affairs was much more laid back about it. And it was External Affairs that they had to apply to, for instance, if they wanted to marry a local woman. Several of the internees, German and British, ended up marrying local women and living in the area, because the whole of the Curragh is sort of a very military orientated area. Whereas in Switzerland, there was a good deal more suspicion. So, again, the internees in Switzerland had to apply to the government for marriage licenses, and they were very, very reluctant to hand out marriage licenses to the internees to marry local women. So it depended on who you asked, frankly.
Well, what did the locals think with all these foreign nationals walking around, let go of the camp? Were relations, because they were allowed to work as well, weren't they?
Yeah, they were eventually allowed to work, and the local population were delighted to get some sort of exotic labour in. It depends on the cultural background. I mean, obviously, all of the Allied internees, bar maybe the one Pole, there was 3 Poles and there was 1 Frenchman in the Curragh in B camp, and they didn't have great English. But all the rest, I mean, there was 31 British, there was 8 Canadians, there was a New Zealander, and there was an American who was the American was in the RAF. So they obviously all spoke English. They looked like the locals and they could blend in. So they had very, very little cultural difficulty, connecting with the locals. And as I said, the Curragh was a very military area. Lots of ex-army, ex-officers still lived there. And because it had been the headquarters of the British Army in Ireland before independence came in 1922, a lot of people who lived in the area were very pro-Allied. A lot of them were ex-army, ex-British Army or ex-RAF themselves. So they had very little difficulties. The Germans, on the other hand, they were a little bit more exotic. A lot of them didn't speak any English. Very few people in Ireland at the time spoke any German. They stood out a bit more, but also because of the fact that the German minister in Dublin was very slow to provide the German internees with civilian clothes, whereas the British Legion in Ireland, the British Legion had lots of offices in Ireland, so they would send, civilian clothes into the internees as soon as they landed. You know, the German internees initially, when they were let out on parole, they were going around in their uniforms. They stuck out like a sore thumb. They stuck out a mile in this small little countryside. But again, gradually as things went on, you know, things began to calm down, and it became a very common sight to see a whole string of German men in Luftwaffe uniforms just cycling down the road, heading towards the cinema in Nace from the Curragh camp. And then towards the end of the war, when the German legation began to run out of money, basically from sort of late 1943 onwards, as things in Berlin began to unravel, the Germans began to look for work in the area, and a lot of them, as I said, were skilled craftsmen. There was a lot of carpenters, a lot of mechanics. There was a remarkably high proportion of very keen gardeners among them. So the local farming community would hire them to work on their land, or garages would hire them to fix cars, and a lot of them made quite a bit of money out of creative. They would make children's toys, they would make manufacture Christmas cards. They generated sort of a little cottage industry within the camp out of necessity, because they were running out of money, and the Irish government tried to help them out financially, but you know, they weren't willing to accept full financial responsibility for them.
Presumably there was some escape attempts. I mean, what would happen if the British could surely just walk out the camp, walk over the border, and that was that?
Well, this is this. I mean, the Curragh camp, it's just over 100 miles away from the border with Northern Ireland. So there were 5 major escape attempts from the British side. So of the 45 Allied internees in B camp, 11 of them eventually escaped. The biggest one was on the 25th of June 1941, when six of them got away. They overpowered the guards. They short-circuited the electricity by throwing an iron bar onto the electrical wires, which fused the whole system. 11 of them got out, and 5 of them were recaptured, but 6 of them got over the border. So there was multiple escape attempts from the British side, because the British forces in Northern Ireland were so close. There was only one successful attempt from the German side, from G camp, because they had much, much less scope to get back to Germany, because Ireland was so close to Britain and so isolated from Germany. And this solitary German escaper was found trying to get onto a Portuguese ship. I think it was in Cork. He was trying to board us, and he was caught, and he was handed over to the British authorities, who locked him up in a POW camp. The whole concept of escape from the camp was very interesting, because the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Prisoners of War, which was applied to the military internees, even though they weren't actually prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention of 1929 laid down that punishments for escapes had to be limited to sort of, suspension of parole or suspension of postal privileges, that sort of thing. The Irish government was very keen to not cause trouble by making punishments overly harsh. So every time there was an escape attempt, basically, their post would be stopped for a week, parole would be restricted, and then things would return to normal. Whereas in Switzerland, the internees who escaped from camps over there, they were actually brought before local courts, the local district courts, and they were given criminal sentences. They were sentenced to 3 months in prison or 6 months in prison, or if they were repeat offenders, they were sent to a special escape-proof camp where they were locked up indefinitely, and they weren't allowed to get their Red Cross parcels or anything like that. But probably the most famous escape from the Curragh was in December 1941, where Roland Bud Wolf, who was the sole American in the camp, he managed to get out. And what he did was he signed out on parole, walked out the gate, pretended he forgot his gloves, walked back in. So technically he had returned from parole, picked up his gloves, and then walked out without signing another release, another parole form, and then just basically drove to the border and crossed over into Derry and rejoined his unit. But because he used parole to escape, the British forces returned him to the Curragh and said, "You can't do that." And they returned him to the camp in the Curragh, and he stayed there until he was released later on in the war.
Am I wrong in saying it's a very odd thing for the British to return him? You would have thought that it had just gone, well,
They were worried, see, because the men who were left behind, the consequences of Wolf's escape would be visited upon the men who were left in the Curragh. So because Wolf had used this, it was a sleight of hand really, sort of like a card trick with the parole form to get out. Because he had used the parole form to get out, the Irish Army said, well, fine, you're just not going to go on parole anymore. So we could just cut off that sort of escape attempt there. And so the men who were left behind in the Curragh, they were facing the possibility of not having any more parole because of what Wolf did. And because on the parole form it says, I will not escape while I'm on parole, nor will I plan to escape while I'm on parole. So he basically broke his pledge. I mean, Maffei and Gray in Dublin both said, yeah, we need to return him because he didn't escape the correct way, if you know what I mean. It sounds like a very odd concept, but it actually does make sense when you think about it because, again, the consequences of what he did would be visited upon the men he was left behind. There was a certain way that you could escape without consequences. So, for instance, there was a couple of tunnels discovered out of the Curragh. That was fine. Basically, you could try and escape from the camp as long as the escape attempt was hatched and conceived from within the wire. If you got any help from the forces outside, or if you got any help from civilians outside, you would have been, just would have been against the rules, so to speak, and you would have been returned. So the 11th escaped. They were all plans that were sort of hatched inside the wire. Now, sometimes the guards were distracted. Sometimes they used tunnels. Sometimes, in one case, they just rushed the front gate because there was many more internees than there were guards. And there was a general reluctance on the part of the guards to actually use live ammunition on the internees because the diplomatic consequences of shooting, a British or a German or a Canadian internee in Ireland would have just been appalling. So the internees very quickly figured out that the guards weren't actually going to fire on them. So sometimes they just rushed the gate, forced the gate open and ran for it. But then, the Curragh is it's a flat plain. It's very, very difficult to hide to actually get to the border. So yeah, escape was a very interesting sort of and confusing sort of concept.
You've got that another potential diplomatic oddity because there was a lot of people from Eire fighting within the British Army. What happens if one of them ends up back in British uniform, British service, on a crash plane in the Republic? What would their status be?
This is another one of the confusing bits of it because basically, Angus, every question is confusing, but this is particularly confusing because the initial internment regime set up by the De Valera government was based on the 1907 Hague Convention and the 1929 Geneva Convention. So these are very sort of vague, aspirational international regulations rather than being, solid rules that they could base this on. And around about 1941, somebody in the Department of Defence realised that if an Irish member of the British forces crashed in Ireland and was interned, he had the right to take a writ of habeas corpus against the Irish government, because the Irish government didn't have the legal right to intern a member of an Irish citizen who had broken an Irish law, if you know what I'm trying to say. If an Irish member of the British forces ended up in the Curragh, he could take a writ, he could get a solicitor, take a writ of habeas corpus. He would then have to be released, which would undermine the whole basis of the internment policy. So basically what the Irish government did is they moved away from the whole idea of relying on international law, and they just enshrined the right to intern belligerent personnel within emergency Irish law. So the De Valera government governed under this, they called it the Emergency Powers Act, which basically gave them a whole range of emergency powers where they could, sometimes if they needed it, they could just bypass Parliament and De Valera would sign what he called an Emergency Powers Order. So in 1942, they instituted Emergency Powers Order 170, 171 and 172, and basically these gave the Irish government the legal power to intern any member of the belligerent forces who landed in Ireland, regardless of their nationality. And this took away the right of the internees to take a writ of habeas corpus against the Irish government, regardless of whether they were Irish or not. So I think that there's two documented occasions where an Irish member of the forces crash landed in Ireland. And in both cases, the government decided that they would just let them go, and they spirited them to the border. Even though they had the legal right at that point, it was probably just too messy to actually incarcerate them, and the headlines that would inevitably follow it.
So what happens when later on in the war, and the British are moving German prisoners of war to Northern Ireland, which they have a chance of escape? What happens to when they escape over the border into the Republic of Ireland? Are they then free, or are they prisoners of what becomes their status? So
under the Hague Convention, which Britain signed in 1907, escaping prisoners of war who make it to a neutral country are supposed to be left at liberty. They're not supposed to be arrested. They're just supposed to be allowed to do what they like. If that means that they want to transit through the country and get back to their own forces, they're supposed to be allowed to do that. Or if they just want to stay and wait out the war Again, they're just supposed to be left at liberty. In December 44 and January 1945, the British government decided to move about 12,500 German POWs to Northern Ireland, because basically the POW camps in mainland Britain were stuffed to capacity between German and Italian prisoners. And Northern Ireland was the last space that was left to the British government. Now, obviously, the Northern Irish Unionist government wasn't terribly pleased at the thought of tens of thousands of German POWs landing in the province when the Eire was still a problem there. As I said, under the Hague Convention, if they made it over the border into Eire, they were supposed to be left at liberty. The thought of this for the De Valera government, this was completely appalling to them. They couldn't even countenance this, because they thought the diplomatic consequences of Eire becoming a safe haven for escaping German POWs would just be horrendous. Ireland was already under pressure from the Allies and was presumed to be pro-Nazi as it was, or pro-Germany. The idea that Eire could act as some sort of safe haven where they couldn't be arrested or deported just couldn't be countenanced. So what the Irish government did is that they set up a 35-mile sort of what they call a zone of control from the Irish border into Eire. So this sort of corridor where if German POWs were discovered within Eire territory, they were to be picked up by the Gardaí, which were the Irish police. They were to be questioned under the 1935 Aliens Act, and they were to be asked for their permit papers, their passports, their entry permits. So under the 1935 Aliens Act, the Irish police had the power to stop and search and ask people for their permit papers. Now, prisoners of war escaping from POW camps in Northern Ireland into Eire, they're clearly not going to have valid papers. They're not going to have passports. They're not going to have diplomatic papers. So instead of applying the 1907 Hague Convention to these escapers, the Irish government decided to use pre-war civilian legislation, which would then allow them to expel them back over the border into Northern Ireland and just wash their hands of them. The De Valera government evaded its international responsibilities because they were so afraid of the diplomatic consequences this close to the end of the war. There's documentary evidence of only 4 prisoners coming over the border and being intercepted by the Gardaí and being sent back. And what the Gardaí would do was basically, they would take them into the station, they'd question them where they came from, where they were going, give them washing facilities, give them a cup of tea, put them back into a police car, drive them through the border and literally open the door and push them across. Because Eire was neutral, obviously, and Northern Ireland was part of a belligerent, they couldn't actually cooperate. So the Irish police couldn't hand them over to the Royal Ulster Constabulary in Northern Ireland. So basically they just had to shove them out the door of the car over the border, and that was then, they were done with it, if you know what I mean. So it was a very, very odd situation. Like most of it, it's a very odd situation. So the men in the camp, in the Curragh, the belligerent internees, the 1907 and 1929 convention is applied to them, even though they are not technically prisoners of war. The actual prisoners of war escaping from Northern Ireland were summarily expelled under pre-existing civilian legislation to avoid the 1929 Geneva Convention being applied to them. And just trying to keep a track of the two parts of this policy operating at the same time, it's extremely confusing. It's extremely frustrating to try and sort out as well.
Yeah, I mean, how much of the neutrality policy is really just, rather than a policy per se, is just pragmatism?
Yeah, well, I mean, people assume that being neutral just means staying out of the war, but it means a constant, you just have to walk this really difficult tightrope, constantly trying to, remain neutral, not breach your own neutrality too much, but also stay on good relations with all of the belligerent powers. And obviously in Ireland's case, they needed to stay on good terms with Britain and the US, particularly the US. When the De Valera government was faced with a choice between, standing up and saying we're going to maintain our neutrality or keeping in the good books of the Allies, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, they chose to keep in the good books of the Allies and were happy to breach neutrality when the situation called for it. Expelling the German POWs back into Northern Ireland, where they would certainly be picked up by the RUC or the British Army again, was one of those times.
It never really occurred to me how actually diplomatically and politically difficult it was to be neutral.
Yeah, it's probably easier to be a belligerent.
Well, you've got clear lines. You understand. It's very easy to understand your relationship with other countries when you actually choose a side. Otherwise, all these questions sort of come up. I only have one other question. It doesn't quite fit in. And was it just a little anecdote you had in the book? Do you want to tell me about the flying boat that crashed in Kerry with the prisoner of war letters?
Oh yeah, that's a sort of a sad and brilliant story at the same time. It was 1943, I believe. There was a plane full of POW letters that were coming from the Far East that were going to be delivered to the UK, to the families in the UK. And there's a mountain in Kerry called Mount Brandon, and the Irish government began to suspect that it actually had some sort of magnetic properties because so many aircraft crashed into it and got lost or crashed into the sea. So this unfortunate flying boat was one of those aircraft that had crashed into it, and the whole crew was killed. No survivors. But when the Irish Army and locals came upon the scene, they found the wreckage strewn right across the mountainside, and they found thousands upon thousands of these POW letters strewn across the mountain. So what they did is the ones that weren't destroyed, they picked them up and they put them into envelopes, they readdressed them, and they paid the postage themselves, and they basically posted them to POW families in the UK through the Irish postal system. When I heard about this, I heard about it very late in the research for the book, so I couldn't put in a great deal about it, but I thought it was the most wonderful gesture of humanity. I mean, they came upon the scene to try and rescue the crew, and when they discovered they were all dead, they did this other thing, knowing that these POW families, the families of these POWs, were desperate for news. And, that these letters were just scattered all over the place. Most of them had burned, most of them had been destroyed in the crash. And just this wonderful sort of incident of humanity in the midst of a war, where these local people just, there were teams of people going through the countryside trying to find as many letters as possible. Teams of them getting envelopes together and paying for the postage themselves, posting it off over to the UK. I thought it was wonderful.
And the letters will have been such a lifeline, a small thread that people will be holding out for, and for them not to come they wouldn't necessarily have been missed, but they're probably used to not getting letters, and then to suddenly get one, it must have been magical.
But this is it, yeah. And then what happened very recently then is the son of one of the families, the son of one of the fathers who was held in one of these Japanese camps, they got the letter. They got the letter to the post. They were astonished to get this to the post. And he, I think it was last year, the year before, he came back over and he visited the area and he talked to the locals and he talked to a lot of the sons and daughters of the locals who had done it and stayed in the local B&B and met the leading personalities. And he was terribly emotional and was so delighted to be there. And he brought the letters with him. Like, he brought the letters back with them that their mothers and fathers and uncles and aunts had collected off the mountainside. So it was a fabulous story. I thought it was great.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story. It's very touching. I like those small stories. Military Internees, Prisoners of War and the Irish State During the Second World War by Bernard Kelly is available now. I'll put a link on the website www.podcast.com. Don't forget to keep up to date with the podcast. You can find me on Facebook, WW2Podcast, and Patreon, patreon.com/WW2Podcast. So until next time, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.